I sat frozen in my parents' cherry-wood paneled office as my father's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. You're just not leadership material, honey. 10 years of dedication to our family construction business, an MBA, and countless 60-hour weeks, all dismissed with a single sentence. My mother nodded in agreement, adding that they needed someone strong enough to handle the pressure. The family business was being transferred to my younger brother Greg, who smirked from across the room. In that moment, everything I believed about my family and my future shattered like glass beneath a hammer. Construction sites were my playground growing up. At age 12, I was already trailing behind Dad at Patterson construction job sites, fascinated by the transformation of empty lots into structures that would stand for generations. While other girls my age collected dolls, I collected blueprints. Dad would ruffle my hair and tell me, Alfreda, one day all this could be yours if you work hard enough. And work hard I did. Every educational choice I made was deliberate business degree followed by an MBA, all aimed at eventually taking over the family business. After graduation, I started at the very bottom of Patterson Construction, working up from administrative assistant to project coordinator to operations manager over 10 years. I wanted to learn every aspect of the business to prove I wasn't expecting any favors because I was the boss's daughter. Dad seemed to be grooming me for leadership. He'd invite me to client meetings, ask for my input on bids, and gradually increased my responsibilities until I was running day-to-day operations. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Alfie, he'd say, using my childhood nickname. I thought my path was clear. Then Greg came home. My brother is 5 years younger than me and had never shown much interest in the family business. After college, he headed to Silicon Valley with big dreams of becoming the next tech mogul. His startup failed after 2 years of burning through investor money. 8 months ago, he returned to town with nothing but designer clothes and an oversized ego. I remember the first family dinner after his return. Greg charmed our parents with wild stories about California and casually dropped names of famous tech entrepreneurs he claimed to know. Dad was captivated, laughing at Greg's jokes and nodding enthusiastically at his vague ideas about modernizing our dinosaur of a company. The construction industry is ripe for disruption, Greg declared, using startup buzzwords that made me cringe. Patterson Construction could be at the forefront. Dad looked impressed. I felt uneasy. Within weeks, I noticed subtle shifts in my parents' attitudes. Dad started inviting Greg to meetings with our biggest clients, meetings I would normally attend. When I asked why I hadn't been included, Dad shrugged it off. Greg just has a way with clients, Alfie. They respond well to him. But I've been building relationships with those clients for years, I protested. That's the problem, Dad said, leaning back in his leather chair. You've gotten too bogged down in details. Greg sees the big picture. The big picture. Greg had been with the company for all of 6 weeks, and suddenly he was a visionary. The first major blow came when I arrived at work on a Tuesday morning to find the conference room doors closed for a meeting I knew nothing about. Through the glass walls, I could see our 5 biggest clients seated around the table with Dad and Greg holding court at the head. When I confronted Dad later, his dismissal stung. It was just a strategic planning session, Alfreda. Greg had some ideas he wanted to present. Ideas about a company he barely knows, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Fresh eyes can see things differently, Dad replied. That's valuable. But the real shock came a week later. I was working late finishing paperwork in my office when I glanced out the window to the parking lot. There was Greg shaking hands with Tyler James, the owner of Pinnacle Construction, our biggest competitor. They were standing by Tyler's luxury SUV, talking animatedly. I watched as they exchanged what looked like documents before parting ways. Why would Greg be meeting secretly with our competitor? And why did he look so pleased with himself? After discovering Greg's secret meeting, I became more determined than ever to prove my worth. I arrived earlier, stayed later, and took on our most challenging projects. When the Westlake development deal, a $12 million contract, was on the verge of collapse due to budget concerns, I spent 3 sleepless nights reworking the numbers and redesigning aspects of the project to bring costs down without sacrificing quality. The client was thrilled, signing the revised contract and even adding a bonus clause. It should have been a defining moment for me at the company. But when I proudly shared the news at our weekly management meeting, Dad barely glanced up from his papers. "Good job, Elfrida," he said flatly before immediately turning to Greg. "Now, tell everyone about that new residential development you landed." Greg puffed up his chest and launched into a description of a contract worth less than a quarter of the one I'd just saved. Yet Dad beamed at him the entire time, interjecting with proud comments like, "That's the kind of innovative thinking that will take this company to the next level." The contrast was unmistakable, and it wasn't just me who noticed. Diane, our company accountant for 15 years, and one of my closest allies, raised her eyebrows at me across the table. Later, she stopped by my office and closed the door. "What's going on with your dad?" she asked bluntly. "I've never seen him this. I don't know. Enamored with someone's ideas, especially when they're not particularly groundbreaking." I shrugged, trying to appear less hurt than I felt. "Apparently Greg has vision, and I'm too detail-oriented," Diane snorted. "Details are what keep construction companies out of lawsuits." As the weeks passed, the dynamic grew more painful. Greg began contradicting my directives in management meetings, suggesting alternatives that often involved cutting corners I wasn't comfortable with. When I stood my ground, Dad would intervene with a placating, "Let's try Greg's approach this time. We need to innovate." Employees didn't know who to listen to anymore. Those who'd been with the company for years still came to me with problems, but newer staff increasingly bypassed me in favor of Greg. The company began feeling like shifting sand beneath my feet. One afternoon, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off some paperwork Dad had forgotten. I was about to announce my presence when I overheard my mother in the kitchen talking to her friend from the country club. "Construction is really a man's business when you get down to it," Mom was saying. "Elfrida's very organized, bless her heart. But Greg has that natural authority. Clients just respond better to him." I stood frozen in the hallway, my mother's words cutting deeper than any criticism from Dad. She'd always encouraged my career choices, at least to my face. Now I knew what she really thought. The final blow of this phase came on my 34th birthday. We had a family tradition of celebrating birthdays at Riverside Steakhouse, and I'd been looking forward to an evening where maybe, just maybe, the tension would ease and we could enjoy each other's company like before. Instead, after the main course, Mom proudly presented Greg with a small velvet box. Inside was our grandfather's vintage Rolex, the watch he'd worn while building the company from nothing. The watch that for as long as I could remember Dad had said would go to whoever took over the family business. "We thought it was time," Dad said, clapping Greg on the shoulder as he tried on the watch. "It looks perfect on you, son." I focused intently on cutting my steak, blinking back tears. They hadn't even bothered to wait until his birthday. They'd hijacked mine to make a statement about succession. That night I couldn't sleep. The stress was affecting my health. I had constant headaches, my appetite had disappeared, and dark circles had taken up permanent residence under my eyes. I felt isolated and betrayed by the people I trusted most. The next day, working late again, I was searching through the digital files for a past project's specifications when I accidentally opened the wrong folder. What I found made my blood run cold. Financial documents showing that Greg had authorized payments totaling over $75,000 to two consulting companies, Bluestream Advisors and Nexus Innovation Group. As operations manager overseeing all major expenditures, I had never heard of either company nor approved any consulting work. I searched our vendor database. Neither company was listed. I Googled both names. Bluestream had a bare-bones website that provided almost no specific information about their services, and Nexus Innovation Group didn't seem to exist at all. What was my brother up to? And how had these payments been approved without crossing my desk? The discovery of those mysterious payments set me on a mission. I spent my evenings researching the shell companies Greg was paying with company funds. Bluestream Advisors had been incorporated just 3 months ago, right around when Greg started working at Patterson Construction. Their listed address turned out to be a virtual office space. Nexus Innovation Group was even sketchier. The only trace of them was a registration form filed in Delaware, with the registered agent being a company that specialized in creating anonymous business entities. When I confronted Greg in his office, a newly renovated space that used to be our conference room, he barely looked up from his computer. "Those are for business development," he said dismissively. "Strategic consulting. To help modernize our approach." "What specifically are they consulting on?" I pressed. "And why wasn't I informed? Any expenditure over $10,000 requires my approval as operations manager." Greg leaned back in his chair. Dad's old chair, I noticed, and smirked. Dad gave me authorization to explore new directions without getting bogged down in bureaucracy. "Proper financial oversight isn't bureaucracy, it's good business," I insisted. "This is exactly why Dad thinks you're not ready for leadership," Greg said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can't see beyond processes and procedures." I took my concerns directly to Dad, printing out the financial documents and transaction histories. He listened impassively as I laid out my case, pointing out the suspicious timing and lack of verifiable services rendered. When I finished, he sighed heavily. "This is why you're not ready to lead, Alfreda. You're focusing on paperwork instead of results. Greg is bringing in new clients. But where is this money actually going?" I asked, frustration mounting. "I've approved these expenditures," Dad said, firmly, effectively ending the conversation. "Greg has my full confidence." That evening, I met my best friend Julia for drinks. Unlike me, Julia had left our hometown after college and built a successful marketing agency in the city. She'd been encouraging me for years to spread my wings beyond the family business. "They're gaslighting you," Julia said bluntly after I recounted the latest events. "You need to decide if you're going to fight for your place or walk away with your dignity intact." "It's not that simple," I protested. "Patterson Construction isn't just a job to me. It's my heritage, my future, everything I've worked for. Is it worth your self-respect?" Julia asked, her eyes soft with concern. "Because from where I'm sitting, they're stripping that away piece by piece." Her words hit hard because they contained truth I wasn't ready to face. Back at the office, I began meticulously documenting everything: the questionable payments, the projects where Greg's influence had led to cut corners, the gradual sidelining of my role. If I was going to fight, I needed ammunition. I scheduled a meeting with Arthur Simmons, our family's attorney, who had handled Patterson Construction's legal affairs for 20 years. Arthur had always been kind to me, even teaching me about construction contract law when I was in college. But when I sat down in his office and began explaining my concerns, his usual warmth was replaced with obvious discomfort. "Alfreda," he interrupted gently, "I need to be clear about something. Your father has instructed me not to discuss certain company matters with you. If you have concerns about the business, you should address them directly with him." I stared at him in disbelief. "You've known me my entire life, Arthur. You know how dedicated I am to this company." "I do," he said, genuine regret in his eyes. "But I also have professional obligations to follow my client's instructions." Another door closed in my face. The company's 30th anniversary party should have been a celebration of our family legacy. Instead, it became the public coronation of Greg as the future of Patterson Construction. Dad made a long speech about the company's history and future, ending with, "And now I'm proud to introduce the person who will lead Patterson Construction into the next 30 years, my son Greg." Applause filled the hotel ballroom as Greg took the microphone, soaking in the adoration. I stood in the shadows at the back of the room, nodding mechanically when employees caught my eye, accepting their awkward condolences disguised as congratulations. "You'll always be the real boss to us," whispered Janet from accounting. "Your brother doesn't know a load-bearing wall from a hole in the ground," muttered Frank from the electrical division. Their support was touching but also humiliating. Everyone was witnessing my sidelining in real time. As I headed for the exit, needing air and distance, a hand caught my elbow. It was Marcus, our site foreman who'd worked for Dad for over 30 years. Marcus was old-school construction, tough as nails and sparing with words. "Got a minute?" he asked, nodding toward the terrace. Outside in the cool evening air, Marcus seemed uncharacteristically nervous, glancing around to ensure we were alone. "Something's not right," he said finally. "Your brother's been giving direct orders on the Riverside project, telling my guys to use cheaper materials than what's in the specs. When I questioned it, he said it was cleared from above." "Did you talk to Dad?" I asked. "Tried to. He told me to follow Greg's instructions and stop bothering him with details." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "But I've been documenting everything. Figured you should see this." He scrolled through a series of photos, support beams that weren't up to code electrical work, that bypassed safety requirements, foundation elements using lower-grade concrete than specified. "This isn't just cutting corners," I said, my stomach sinking. "This is dangerous. And illegal." "I know," Marcus said grimly. "I've been in construction my whole life. Never seen anything like this at Patterson. Your grandfather would roll over in his grave." As I looked through the damning photos, a terrible suspicion began forming in my mind. What if Greg wasn't just incompetent? What if he was deliberately undermining the company? And if so, why? Armed with Marcus's photos and my own documentation, I requested a family meeting. We gathered on Sunday evening in my parents' living room, the same room where as a child I'd played with building blocks, while Dad told me stories about the great buildings our company had constructed. "I need you both to look at this evidence," I said, laying out printed copies of the photos, financial documents, and project specifications side by side on the coffee table. "Greg has been authorizing payments to shell companies, cutting corners on safety, and undermining the reputation we've spent 3 decades building." Dad barely glanced at the evidence. Mom refused to look entirely. "This is what I'm talking about, Dad," said his voice tight with anger. "Always focusing on paperwork and problems instead of possibilities. These aren't just problems," I insisted. "These are serious violations that could destroy the company." "You're overreacting," Greg said smoothly. "Construction always involves making adjustments on the fly. The materials I've substituted are perfectly adequate. They don't meet code requirements," I countered. "And they certainly don't meet Patterson quality standards." "Maybe those standards are outdated," Greg suggested with a shrug. "Maybe that's why we've been losing market share to companies like Pinnacle." "We've never compromised on safety or quality," I said firmly. "That's why our buildings stand the test of time while our competitors face lawsuits down the road." Mom finally spoke up, her voice sharp. "Elfrida, can't you see what you're doing? You're so jealous of your brother's success that you're trying to sabotage him with these accusations." Her words struck like a physical blow. "This isn't about jealousy," I said quietly. "This is about protecting our family legacy. Everything Dad and Grandpa built. If you cared about the family legacy Dad cut in, you'd support your brother instead of undermining him at every turn." "I've tried to support him," I protested. "I've tried to guide him, to teach him the business. But he doesn't want to learn. He wants to take shortcuts." "That's because you're too rigid," Dad said dismissively. "Always have been. Too soft in some ways, too inflexible in others. That's why we knew you weren't cut out for leadership." Greg leaned forward, his face a mask of false sympathy. "Look, sis, why don't you stick to what you're good at? The organizational stuff, the detail work. Leave the big decisions to me." In that moment, a terrible clarity washed over me. Nothing I said or did would change their minds. The narrative was fixed. Greg was the visionary leader, and I was the jealous sister who couldn't see beyond spreadsheets and rulebooks. I spent that night pacing my apartment, sleepless and agonized. By morning, I'd called Julia. "I need advice," I told her. "Objective advice from someone who isn't enmeshed in this whole mess." We met at a cafe far from my usual haunts, where no one from Patterson Construction would overhear. I laid out everything. The evidence, the confrontation, my parents' dismissal. "What am I missing, Julia? Am I crazy? Am I really just jealous and unable to see it?" Julia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're not crazy. They're gaslighting you because it's easier than admitting they're wrong. But here's the question you need to answer. How long are you willing to fight for approval that may never come?" Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. How much of my life had been spent seeking Dad's approval? How much more was I willing to sacrifice? You deserve better than this, Alfie Julia continued. You're brilliant, dedicated, ethical. Any company would be lucky to have you. But Patterson Construction is in my blood, I said, voicing the fear that had kept me tethered to a deteriorating situation for too long. Is it worth your soul? Julia asked simply. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A text from Diane: need to see you as soon as possible. Not at the office. 20 minutes later, I met Diane in the parking lot of a grocery store. Her normally composed face was tight with worry. I've found something, she said without preamble, handing me a file folder. Greg's been in talks with Tyler James at Pinnacle. He's planning to sell them our riverfront property, the land we've been holding for future development. I flipped through the documents, preliminary sales agreements for a prime piece of real estate our company had owned for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to develop. The proposed sale price was nearly 40% below market value. This makes no sense, I said, scanning the numbers again. Why would he sell at such a loss? Because Diane said grimly, according to a draft contract I found in his email, he's getting a personal kickback and a guaranteed executive position at Pinnacle after the sale. The pieces suddenly locked into place. Greg wasn't just incompetent. He was deliberately sabotaging Patterson Construction from within, weakening it for his own gain. He's selling us out, I whispered. Literally. I drove straight to the office, Diane's documents clutched in my hand. I didn't bother knocking before entering the executive conference room where Dad, Mom, and Greg were meeting with our bank's loan officer. Excuse the interruption, I said coldly, but this can't wait. I laid out the riverfront property documents in the center of the table. Would you like to explain why you're selling our most valuable asset at a 40% loss, Greg? Or should I tell everyone about your side deal with Tyler James? The loan officer looked alarmed. Greg's face flushed dark red. This is completely inappropriate, Alfreda, Dad snapped. We're in the middle of a meeting. Yes, a meeting about the company's financial health, I said. Which is directly relevant to the fact that your son is deliberately tanking our assets for personal gain. These are complex strategic decisions, Greg blustered. You don't understand the big picture. I understand betrayal perfectly well, I replied, then turned to face my father directly. I've given this company everything. My education, my 20s, my nights, and weekends. I've learned every aspect of the business from the ground up. And this is how you repay my loyalty. By handing the reins to someone who's actively working against our interests. Alfreda, Dad began, but I cut him off. No. I'm done. I resign effective immediately. I placed my company keycard on the table. This is business, not personal, right? That's what you always say. Well, I'm making a business decision to stop investing in a company that doesn't value me. Dad's face paled. You can't just leave. The Westlake project is fully documented and can be managed by your golden boy here, I said. After all, he's the leader you wanted, the one with vision. Let's see how that vision works out when he's not just undermining me but selling you out to your biggest competitor. I locked eyes with each of them. In turn, Greg's petulant glare, Mom's shocked expression, Dad's dawning uncertainty. Leadership isn't just about charisma, I said finally. It's about integrity, foresight, and putting the company before yourself. Remember that. When you're picking up the pieces, I turned and walked out, my heart pounding but my mind remarkably clear. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Clearing out my office under the watchful eyes of loyal employees was one of the most painful experiences of my life. Janet from accounting cried openly. Marcus helped carry boxes to my car, his weathered face set in grim lines. Younger staff members watched in confusion, whispering among themselves. This isn't right, Alfreda, Diane said, as she helped me pack up 10 years of professional life. What they're doing, it's not just unfair to you. It's dangerous for the company. I know, I said carefully, wrapping the framed photo of my grandfather breaking ground on his first major project. But I can't fix something they don't think is broken. As I was loading the last box, 3 of our project managers approached Scott, Tanya, and Raoul, each responsible for multi-million-dollar developments. Can we talk? Scott asked, glancing around nervously. Privately, we walked to a coffee shop down the street. Once seated in a corner booth, they shared their concerns. Greg's been changing specifications without consulting the architects, Tanya said. When I questioned it, he told me to stop being difficult. He's reassigning our best crews to projects that don't make sense, Raoul added. The Westlake timeline is now impossible because he moved half the team to that small retail job in Oakdale. We respect your father, Scott said carefully, but the company's heading for serious trouble. Their concerns validated my decision, but also deepened my sadness. These were good people who'd committed their careers to Patterson Construction. Now they were caught in what increasingly looked like a deliberate dismantling. Document everything I advised them. And be careful. The next few weeks passed in a fog. Without the structure of work, I felt untethered. My identity had been so wrapped up in Patterson Construction that I hardly knew who I was without it. I ignored calls from my parents and deflected questions from family friends about my sudden career change. Julia became my lifeline. You need space to process, she insisted. Let's get out of town for a while. We spent 2 weeks at her beach house on the coast. During long walks on empty beaches, I began to imagine a different future one. I created myself without seeking anyone's approval. I could start my own firm. I mused one evening as we watched the sunset. Smaller scale, focusing on sustainable building practices. There's a growing market for that, and Patterson has been slow to adapt. You could, Julia agreed. You have the knowledge, the experience, and the reputation. And I know at least a dozen clients who'd follow you anywhere. Returning home with newfound clarity, I began putting together a business plan. I had savings and a small inheritance from my grandmother that I'd never touched. It wouldn't fund anything on the scale of Patterson Construction, but it was enough to start something lean and focused. I registered Cornerstone Construction, a name that acknowledged my foundation in the industry while establishing my own identity. I leased a small office space, created a website highlighting my experience and vision, and began reaching out to contacts. My first call was to Marcus. I'm starting my own company, I told him, focusing on sustainable building practices and ethical business standards. I could use an experienced site foreman. There was a long pause before Marcus responded. Funny timing. I just gave my notice at Patterson this morning. Why? I asked, surprised. Let's just say your brother and I had a disagreement about whether support beams should actually support anything. His dry delivery made me laugh despite everything. When do I start? With Marcus on board, things began moving quickly. A former client who'd heard about my departure reached out about a modest but interesting renovation project, converting an old warehouse into a mixed-use space with apartments and small business incubators. The budget was tight, but the client was passionate about sustainability and community impact values that aligned perfectly with my vision for Cornerstone. As I threw myself into planning this first project, other pieces began falling into place. A talented young architect I'd worked with at Patterson, frustrated by Greg's dismissal of her innovative designs, asked if I needed design services. 2 suppliers I'd built relationships with over the years offered favorable credit terms despite my new company's unproven status. 6 months later, Cornerstone Construction had completed 3 projects, had 2 more in progress, and was bidding on several others. We'd developed a reputation for quality work, transparent pricing, and sustainable practices. I'd hired 7 full-time employees, including 3 who had left Patterson, not because I poached them, but because they sought me out after conditions there continued to deteriorate. I maintained strict professional boundaries around discussing my family or former company. When clients or industry colleagues asked why I'd left Patterson, I simply said, it was time to pursue my own vision and changed the subject. Taking the high road was sometimes painfully difficult, but it preserved my professional integrity. My leadership style naturally developed as a counterpoint to what I'd experienced. Where my father had been authoritarian and Greg manipulative, I strove to be collaborative and transparent. I invited input from all team members, shared financial goals openly, and made sure everyone understood how their work contributed to our success. Industry gossip occasionally brought news of Patterson Construction, They'd lost the Westlake contract after missing critical deadlines. Their bank had increased oversight on loans after financial irregularities came to light. Their reputation among subcontractors was suffering as payment delays became common. I took no pleasure in these reports. Despite everything, I still cared about the company my grandfather had built, and about the many good people who worked there. Then came the call that changed everything. It was just after 7 on a Tuesday evening. I was at my kitchen table reviewing bids for a new project when my phone lit up with my father's number. After 6 months of silence, the sight of it made my heart race. I almost didn't answer. "Hello, Alfreda." His voice sounded strange, strained, and smaller than I remembered. "There's been an accident." His voice sounded strange. My mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. "Mom, is she okay?" "It's not your mother. It's at the Hill Street project. A scaffold collapsed. 2 workers injured, one seriously." I closed my eyes, a wave of nausea washing over me. The Hill Street project, a 6-story office building, was Patterson's biggest current job. How bad? Bad enough. OSHA's involved. There will be an investigation. He paused, his breathing heavy. "And that's not all. Greg's gone." "What do you mean gone?" "Left town. Emptied his accounts. Haven't heard from him in 3 days." Another long pause. Right after we discovered money missing from the company accounts. The pieces clicked into place: the accident, the missing money, Greg's disappearance. It was the culmination of everything I'd warned them about. "I'm sorry that happened," I said carefully. "Alfie?" my father said, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years. "I need your help. The company's in trouble. Real trouble." "You have other managers," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "None who understand the whole operation like you do." His voice cracked. "I made a terrible mistake. I see that now. Please, just meet with me. Let me explain." As his words registered, I felt a complicated surge of emotions. Vindication, lingering, anger, and something else I wasn't prepared for. Concern for my father, who suddenly sounded old and broken. "Dad, please," he interrupted, and then to my shock I heard him begin to cry. In 34 years I had never heard my father cry. "Everything your grandfather built, everything I built, everything you helped build, it's all falling apart. I don't know how to fix it without you." I sat in stunned silence, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to my proud, stubborn father weep. The 6 months after leaving Patterson Construction had been transformative. Cornerstone had grown from a concept to a promising reality, with 9 employees, 5 completed projects, and a growing reputation for excellence. Our focus on sustainable building practices had attracted clients specifically looking for environmentally responsible construction, opening up a niche market that Patterson had largely ignored. My new office, a renovated loft space filled with plants and natural light, was a stark contrast to Patterson's traditional, somewhat stuffy headquarters. The atmosphere was collaborative rather than hierarchical. Every Friday we gathered for lunch to discuss current projects, address challenges, and celebrate successes. It was during one of these Friday lunches that Marcus mentioned hearing rumors about Patterson losing subcontractors. "My buddy at Reliable Electric says they're requiring payment up front now," he reported. "Too many delayed payments in the past few months." I nodded but didn't encourage further discussion. I'd maintained a strict policy of not gossiping about my former company, both out of professional ethics and self-preservation. Still, it was impossible to ignore the industry chatter about Patterson's declining reputation. 3 former Patterson employees had joined my team, not because I recruited them, but because they sought me out. Tanya, one of the project managers who had expressed concerns on my last day, had been the most recent addition. Her expertise with commercial properties complemented our growing portfolio perfectly. "Working here is like breathing fresh air after being underwater," she told me during her first week. "I can actually sleep at night knowing we're not cutting corners." Her comment reminded me of all the reasons I'd started Cornerstone. It wasn't just about proving I could succeed on my own. It was about creating a company that reflected my values of integrity, sustainability, and respect for everyone involved in the building process. The call from my father had shattered my carefully maintained boundary between past and present. After hanging up, I paced my apartment for hours, wrestling with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to reject his plea outright to let him face the consequences of choosing Greg over me. But another part couldn't ignore the human cost of Patterson's collapse, dozens of employees who might lose their jobs, clients whose projects would be left unfinished, my family's legacy erased. The next morning I called Diane, who had remained at Patterson as financial controller. "How bad is it really?" I asked without preamble. She sighed heavily. "Worse than your dad probably admitted. The Hill Street accident is just the tip of the iceberg. OSHA's investigating, and they've already found multiple safety violations. The injured worker's family is talking to lawyers. We're facing potential criminal negligence charges. And the financial situation? Greg emptied 2 project accounts before disappearing, nearly $300,000 gone. We can't pay suppliers, can't make payroll next month unless we secure an emergency loan, which isn't looking promising given the circumstances." Tyler James. The riverfront property deal. That fell through when you exposed it. But Greg found other ways to siphon money. He had me set up automatic payments to those consulting companies you flagged, told me your dad had approved them. I should have questioned it more. Her voice cracked with regret. "This isn't on you, Diane," I assured her. "What about Dad? How is he really?" "Broken," she said simply. "The man I saw yesterday isn't the Jack Patterson I've known for 15 years. He's aged a decade in 6 months. Barely leaves his office. When the news about Greg stealing company funds broke, he just sat there staring at the wall for hours. After hanging up, I called Julia for advice. My father's asking for help saving the company. After everything that happened, I don't know what to do." "What do you want to do?" Julia asked. "Not what you think you should do. What do you actually want?" I considered the question carefully. I don't want Patterson Construction to fail. Not because of my father or his choices, but because of all the people who depend on it for their livelihoods. And because my grandfather built something that meant something in this community. "Then help," Julia said simply. "But on your terms, not theirs." That evening I called a meeting with my Cornerstone team. They deserve to know what might be coming. "My father has asked for my help with Patterson Construction," I explained. "They're in serious trouble, safety violations, financial irregularities, potential legal issues. I haven't decided what to do yet, but I wanted to be transparent with all of you." "Are you considering going back?" Marcus asked, his expression concerned. "Not in the way you might think," I replied. "But I am considering how Cornerstone might help stabilize the situation. It could mean anything from consulting to some form of merger." Tanya looked alarmed. "After how they treated you." "This isn't about my parents or my brother," I said firmly. "It's about the employees who might lose their jobs, the clients whose projects are in jeopardy, and, yes, a company that's been part of this community for 2 generations. Whatever you decide," Marcus said after a moment, "we've got your back." The support of my team gave me strength. As I prepared to meet with my father the next day, I spent hours researching Patterson's current projects, financial status, and legal exposure. By morning, I had outlined several possible approaches, depending on how bad things truly were. My father looked small behind his massive desk, diminished somehow, his confident posture replaced by a defeated slump. Mom sat beside him, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. "Thank you for coming, Dad," said his voice rough. "I'm here to listen," I replied neutrally. "I need to understand exactly what's happening before I can decide if or how I might help." Over the next 2 hours, they laid out the full extent of the crisis. Greg had systematically undermined the company from within, pushing for corner cutting that led to the Hill Street accident, embezzling funds through fake consulting contracts, alienating key clients with broken promises, and finally, disappearing with liquid assets 3 days before the scaffold collapse. "The bank is threatening to call our loans," Dad explained. We've missed 2 payments, and with the pending lawsuits, they see us as high risk. Why didn't you see what was happening? I asked the question. I'd been holding back, finally escaping. I showed you evidence. I warned you repeatedly. Dad's face crumpled. Because I wanted to believe in him. Because it was easier than admitting I'd been wrong about both of you. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. And because I was too proud to acknowledge that my daughter understood this business better than I did. Mom reached for my hand across the desk. I let her take it, feeling the slight tremble in her fingers. We were wrong, Elfrida, she said simply. So terribly wrong. Their admission was something I'd longed for, but now that it had come, I found it brought less satisfaction than I'd imagined. What mattered more was what happened next. I need to think, I said, standing. I'll let you know my decision tomorrow. That night, I consulted with Cornerstone's attorney, reviewing options for how we might approach the situation. By morning, I had a proposal, one that protected my new company while potentially salvaging what could be saved of Patterson Construction. When I returned to my father's office, I brought Julia as my advisor and emotional support. My parents had Arthur Simmons with them, looking distinctly uncomfortable. I'm willing to help. I began, placing a folder on the desk. But only on these terms. The proposal was straightforward, a merger of Patterson Construction and Cornerstone with me as CEO of the combined entity. Patterson's assets would be evaluated fairly, its debts addressed transparently, and its legal issues resolved ethically. My parents would retain ownership shares but step back from operations. The new company would adopt Cornerstone's commitment to sustainable practices and ethical business standards. This isn't a bailout, I explained as they reviewed the terms. It's a restructuring that might save jobs and salvage the Patterson legacy, but with significant changes to how business is done. You want us to give up control, Dad, said his voice flat. Yes, I confirmed without hesitation. You've lost the right to control through a series of disastrous decisions. But you haven't lost the right to see your life's work continue in a new form. Mom touched Dad's arm gently. Jack, she's right. We need to accept this. Dad stared at the proposal for a long moment, then looked up at me with a mixture of sadness and something that might have been respect. When did you become so formidable? He asked quietly. I've always been formidable, I replied. You just couldn't see it. He signed the agreement. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging of my professional life. Merging 2 construction companies. One failing but established. One successful but new required intense effort from everyone involved. I worked 16-hour days addressing Patterson's immediate crises while maintaining Cornerstone's ongoing projects. The Hill Street accident required particular attention. Rather than fighting the injured workers' claims, I met with him and his family, directly acknowledged the company's responsibility, and offered a settlement that covered his medical expenses, lost wages, and pain and suffering. I then implemented comprehensive new safety protocols across all projects and invited OSHA to inspect our procedures. Financial restructuring was equally complex. Diane and I spent countless hours untangling Greg's web of fraudulent transactions, working with the bank to renegotiate loans, and creating transparent financial reporting for all stakeholders. We had to let some staff go, but far fewer than would have lost jobs if Patterson had collapsed completely. 3 weeks into this process, Greg returned. Not willingly, he was brought back in police custody, having been arrested in Arizona, attempting to cross into Mexico with fake identification. The embezzlement charges against him were just the beginning. As investigations proceeded, evidence emerged of kickbacks from subcontractors, deliberate safety violations, and fraud. The day after his arrest, I visited him in the county detention center. He sat across from me, in his orange jumpsuit, somehow still managing to look smug. Come to gloat, sis. No, I said calmly. I came to ask why. Was it just about the money? Or did you really hate the family that much? His facade cracked slightly. You all thought you were so perfect. The great Patterson legacy. Dad never thought I was good enough. Not until I started acting like him, pushing people around, talking big. Then suddenly I was Leadership material. His laugh was bitter. What a joke. You could have walked away, I pointed out. Started your own path like I did eventually. You didn't have to hurt people. Easy for you to say. You were always the golden child. The one who understood the business, who had Dad's respect. Even when he wouldn't admit it. His eyes narrowed. Until you weren't. How did that feel, Elfrida? To be replaced so easily? I considered his question seriously. Devastating, I admitted. But not devastating enough to abandon my principles or break the law. That was your choice, Greg. Not something forced on you by circumstances. As I stood to leave, he called after me. They'll turn on you again, you know. It's what they do. Maybe I acknowledged. But I'm not doing this for them anymore. The truth of that statement sustained me through the difficult months that followed. I wasn't saving Patterson Construction for my parents' approval or to prove Greg wrong. I was doing it because building something worthwhile, something with integrity, was important to me. Because the employees deserved better leadership. Because my grandfather's legacy deserved preservation even in a new form. My father struggled with his diminished role at first. Decades of being the ultimate authority made it difficult for him to accept my leadership decisions, especially when they contradicted his traditional approaches. But gradually, as he witnessed the company stabilizing under my direction, his resistance softened. Mom's journey was more complicated. Her belief that construction is a man's business had been deeply ingrained, shaped by her generation and upbringing. Seeing me successfully lead the merged companies challenged assumptions she'd held her entire life. One evening, working late at the office, I was surprised when she appeared in my doorway with takeout food. Thought you might be hungry, she said, setting the bags on my desk. You work too hard, just like your father used to. As we ate, she watched me reviewing project plans. I was wrong about you, she said suddenly. About what you could do. What women can do in this industry. It was never about gender, I replied gently. It was about who understood the business better, and who had its best interests at heart. She nodded slowly. I see that now. Too late, maybe, but I see it. It's not too late, I told her. We're still here. The company's still here, even if it's changing. The smile she gave me was tinged with regret, but also genuine. It was a start. 1 year after the merger, Patterson Cornerstone Construction had not only stabilized but was thriving. We'd successfully completed all projects that had been in jeopardy, repaired relationships with subcontractors and suppliers, and established a reputation for both quality work and ethical business practices. The transition hadn't been smooth or easy. We'd faced skepticism from clients, burned by the old Patterson management, resistance from some longtime employees, uncomfortable with change and the continuing legal fallout from Greg's actions. But we'd addressed each challenge head-on with transparency and integrity. My father had gradually found his place in the new organization. After initially struggling with his reduced role, he discovered a talent for mentoring younger staff members, sharing his decades of practical knowledge while respecting the new direction I'd established. Watching him patiently explain construction techniques to our newest project manager, skills that couldn't be learned from textbooks, I glimpsed the teacher he might have always been, if his need for control hadn't gotten in the way. Mom had surprised everyone by developing an interest in sustainable building practices, researching eco-friendly materials, and attending industry conferences on green construction. If we're going to change, she told me, let's really change. Her enthusiasm had helped win over some of the more traditional clients who might otherwise have been resistant to our new approaches. Greg's legal troubles had concluded with a plea deal, 5 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement, with the possibility of parole after 3. The family had struggled with how to respond to his crimes. After much discussion and several difficult family therapy sessions, we'd settled on a position of loving the person, while condemning the actions visiting him in prison, but also testifying honestly about the damage he'd caused. Those therapy sessions had revealed deeper patterns in our family dynamics. My father's insecurity about his own leadership projected onto me. My mother's internalized sexism from her upbringing in a traditional household. My own perfectionism and need for approval. Greg's lifelong feeling of inadequacy and resentment. Understanding these patterns didn't excuse harmful behavior, but it helped us avoid repeating destructive cycles. The morning of Patterson Cornerstone's first anniversary as a merged company, I arrived at the office to find my team had organized a surprise celebration. The conference room was decorated with photos showing both companies' projects through the years, culminating in our most recent accomplishments. Speech called Marcus as employees gathered with coffee and pastries. I looked around at the faces before me. Some who'd been with Patterson for decades, others who'd joined Cornerstone at its beginning, and several new hires attracted by our growing reputation. They represented the best of both worlds: experience and innovation, tradition and progress. A year ago I began, many people thought this merger couldn't work, that the wounds were too deep, the challenges too great. But what they didn't understand was that good buildings aren't just about materials and designs. They're about the people who create them, the values they embody, and the communities they serve. I gestured to the project photos on the walls. Every structure we've built or renovated this year represents our commitment to quality, sustainability, and integrity. But more importantly, they represent what we can achieve when we value every voice, respect every contribution, and never forget that leadership isn't about power, it's about service. After the celebration, I returned to my office to find my father waiting, a small package in his hands. "I've been wanting to give you this for a while," he said, placing it on my desk. "Wasn't sure if you'd accept it." I unwrapped the package to find my grandfather's vintage Rolex, the watch that had once symbolized my exclusion from leadership. "Dad, it always should have been yours," he said simply. "You're the true heir to what your grandfather built. Not just the business, but the principles behind it." I slipped the watch onto my wrist, surprised by how right it felt there. "Thank you," he nodded, uncharacteristically emotional. "I was wrong about you, Alfie. Wrong in ways that nearly cost us everything. I'm not asking for forgiveness." "But you have it anyway," I interrupted gently. "Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to resentment would only hurt me in the end." "You're a better leader than I ever was," he admitted. "Took me too long to see it." That evening, we hosted a client appreciation event at our newly renovated headquarters. Local business leaders, government officials, and industry colleagues gathered to tour the space, which showcased sustainable building materials and energy-efficient systems. The mayor presented us with an award for our restoration of a historic downtown building, praising our commitment to preserving architectural heritage while incorporating modern environmental standards. As I mingled with guests, the regional director of the Green Building Council approached. "Ms. Patterson, I wanted to personally invite you to speak at our national conference next month. Your company's transformation is exactly the kind of case study our industry needs, proof that ethical, sustainable practices can also be good business." The invitation was a significant honor, recognizing our impact beyond local borders. As I accepted, I caught sight of my mother across the room, deep in conversation with a young woman who had recently joined our design team. Mom was genuinely listening, nodding thoughtfully at whatever the designer was explaining. It was a small moment, but representative of how far we'd all come. Later that week, that same young designer, Emma, knocked tentatively on my office door. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She sat nervously adjusting her portfolio. "I was wondering if you might consider mentoring me. I'm learning so much technically, but watching how you navigate leadership challenges, especially as a woman in construction, that's what I really want to understand." Her request took me by surprise. I'd been so focused on building the company that I hadn't considered my impact on the next generation of professionals. "I'd be honored," I told her, "though I'm still learning myself." "That's part of what I admire," Emma said earnestly. "You don't pretend to have all the answers. You listen. You adapt. That's the kind of leader I want to be someday." Her words made me reflect on my journey from the devastated daughter being told she wasn't leadership material to the CEO whose leadership style was now something others wanted to emulate. The path had been painful, but I wouldn't change it. Each setback had forced me to define my own values, rather than simply inheriting someone else's. True leadership, I'd discovered, wasn't about power or control or even vision in isolation. It was about integrity, doing what's right, even when it's difficult. It was about empathy, understanding others' perspectives and needs. And it was about courage, standing firm in your principles when challenged, and admitting when you're wrong. The family wounds that had seemed unhealable a year ago had begun to mend, not through ignoring truth, but by facing it directly. My parents were coming to terms with their mistakes. I was learning to lead without seeking their constant approval. Even Greg from his prison cell was beginning to acknowledge the damage his actions had caused. Healing didn't mean forgetting or pretending the hurt never happened. It meant moving forward with clear eyes, creating something new and stronger from the broken pieces of the past. As I mentored Emma in the months that followed, I often thought about that moment in my parents' office when they told me I wasn't leadership material. They'd been wrong, but their rejection had ultimately forced me to discover my own leadership style. One based not on dominance, but on collaboration. Not on fear, but on mutual respect. Sometimes the greatest gift is being underestimated. It frees you to define success on your own terms, to build something authentic, rather than living up to someone else's expectations. In losing what I thought I wanted, I'd found something better, not just a company to lead, but a way of leading that reflected my true self. Have you ever faced a situation where someone's lack of faith in you became the catalyst for your greatest growth? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience and transformation. And if you know someone struggling with family expectations or workplace challenges, share this with them. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles makes all the difference. Thank you for listening, and remember, true leadership isn't given to you. It's something you build within yourself, one difficult decision at a time.